6 babies, 6 nights, and not a single second of sleep. Yet the most powerful man in the city was about to lose to something he could not control. The crying never stopped. It bled through the walls of the Moretti estate, echoing down marble hallways and into rooms filled with silence that no amount of money could fix. 6 newborns, barely weeks old, their tiny voices rising and falling in a relentless rhythm that felt less like sound and more like a warning. The chandeliers above shimmered in cold light, casting reflections across polished floors that had never known chaos like this. Nurses had come and gone, each one lasting less than a day. Specialists were flown in from across the country, men and women with degrees and confidence, all leaving with the same defeated look. Nothing worked. Nothing lasted. And in the center of it all stood Vincent Moretti, a man whose name alone could quiet entire rooms, now pacing back and forth like a stranger in his own home. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. Not really. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing inked skin and trembling hands that betrayed a truth no one dared to say out loud. Power meant nothing here. Not against hunger. Not against pain. Not against 6 fragile lives crying for something no one could give them. Down the hallway, unnoticed as always, Amara Johnson stood still with a mop resting against her shoulder. She had been in the house for 5 days. 5 days of silence, of lowered eyes, of moving through spaces as if she didn't exist. That was the rule. Stay invisible. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch anything that isn't yours. And above all, never go near the children. The head housekeeper had made that clear on her first morning, her voice sharp as glass. You're just a maid. You clean. That's all. Amara had nodded, like she always did, because survival sometimes meant shrinking yourself until no one noticed you were there. But tonight, invisibility felt different. Tonight, it felt like failure. The crying shifted, one voice rising above the others, thinner, weaker. Something in it made her chest tighten. Her grip on the mop loosened. She turned her head slightly, eyes drawn toward the closed nursery doors at the end of the hall. Warm air brushed against her skin, but it wasn't heat she felt. It was something deeper, something her body hadn't forgotten. Beneath her uniform, fabric clung to her skin, damp in a way she couldn't ignore anymore. She had tried to hide it all day, folding her arms, keeping her distance, pretending it wasn't there. But the truth was quiet and relentless. Her body was still responding to a child who was no longer here. 2 months ago, she had held her own baby for the last time. 2 months ago, the world had gone silent in a way no one could hear. And yet now, surrounded by noise, her body remembered what her heart was still trying to survive. Another cry pierced through the hallway, sharper this time, almost breaking. Amara closed her eyes for a second too long. Somewhere down the hall, footsteps moved quickly, voices low and urgent, but no one entered the nursery. No one fixed it. The mansion held its breath. She opened her eyes again, steady now, her gaze locked on the door that everyone else avoided. The rule echoed in her mind. Don't touch them. Her feet moved anyway. Slow at first, then certain. Each step softer than the last against the marble floor. The closer she got, the louder it became, not just the crying, but the weight of everything no one was willing to do. Her hand hovered just inches from the handle. For a moment, time stretched thin. She could lose everything. The job, the roof over her head, maybe more than that. But behind that door, 6 babies were still crying. And something inside her refused to stay still any longer. Her fingers curled around the handle. And the moment she pushed the door open, the world changed. The nursery was brighter than the hallway, but it did not feel warm. White lights hummed overhead, too clean, too sharp, illuminating 6 small cribs arranged in a perfect row like something designed for order, not comfort. And inside them, chaos. The crying hit her all at once, louder, closer, almost physical. It filled the air, layered and uneven, 6 different voices with 6 different needs, all blending into one endless sound that pressed against her chest. For a second, Amara did not move. Her breath caught, her eyes scanning the room, as if she had stepped into something sacred and forbidden at the same time. Each baby twisted in their blankets, tiny hands, clenched, faces red with exhaustion more than anything else. Not just hunger, not just discomfort, something deeper, something no one had figured out. She swallowed slowly, forcing her body to stay steady. This was not her place. That thought repeated in her mind like a warning. You do not belong here. But then one of the babies let out a smaller cry, weaker than the others, and everything else faded. Amara stepped forward, her movements careful, almost reverent. She stopped beside the nearest crib, her hands hovering just above the rail, as if asking permission from something she could not see. The baby inside shifted again, searching, restless. She could feel it now, the pull she had been fighting since she first heard them from the hallway. It was not a decision anymore. It was instinct. Her fingers finally touched the edge of the crib, then slipped beneath the blanket, lifting the child gently into her arms. The crying did not stop right away. It trembled, stuttered, like a storm unsure if it should pass. Amara adjusted her hold, cradling the baby closer to her chest, her voice barely more than a breath. "It is okay," she whispered, the words soft, steady, the way she used to say them before everything changed. Her body responded before her mind could argue. The tension in her shoulders eased, her breathing slowed, and something unspoken passed between her and the child she held. Seconds stretched. Then, almost impossibly, the baby's cries softened. Not gone. Not yet. But different. Less desperate. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, feeling it, recognizing it. This was not something learned from a book. This was memory. She shifted slightly, her movements becoming more certain now, more natural, as if her body remembered what her life had lost. Behind her, the other 5 babies were still crying, the sound rising again, filling the room with urgency. She opened her eyes and looked at them, all of them, small and fragile and waiting. Her heart tightened, not from fear this time, but from something stronger. She could walk away. She could put this child back, close the door, and pretend she had never stepped inside. No one would know, but they would still be crying, and she would still hear it. Her gaze dropped to the baby in her arms, now quieter, small breaths replacing the sharp cries from before. She made her choice in that moment, not with words, but with action. Carefully, she stepped toward the second crib, then the third. Her movements quickened, not rushed, but deliberate, as she worked between them, lifting, soothing, adjusting, doing what no one else had managed to do. The room began to change, not all at once, but piece by piece. One voice softened, then another. The sound that had once filled every corner of the space began to shift, breaking apart, losing its edge. It was not silence yet, but it was something close. And for the first time in days, the nursery did not feel like a place of defeat. It felt like something was finally being understood. The shift was so subtle at first that no one outside the room would have noticed it, but inside the nursery, it felt like the air itself had changed. The sharp, desperate cries that had once overlapped into a single unbearable noise were breaking apart, softening into uneven whimpers, then into something quieter, something closer to rest. Amara moved carefully between the cribs, her arms never empty for long, her presence steady, grounded, as if she carried something into the room that had been missing all along. One by one, she adjusted blankets, repositioned tiny bodies, letting instinct guide her where instructions had failed. She did not rush. She did not panic. Every movement had purpose, shaped by memory and loss, and a kind of knowledge no one had asked her about. The baby in her arms had gone completely still now, small breaths rising and falling against her chest. And for a moment, she simply stood there, holding that silence like something fragile. Then another cry flickered from the far crib, softer than before, almost questioning. Amara turned, her steps measured, and reached for the next child, her voice low and calm as she murmured words that were not meant to be heard, only felt. Across the room, the transformation continued. Not perfect, not immediate, but undeniable. The space that had once felt overwhelmed now held something steadier, something human. Outside the nursery, the hallway remained tense, footsteps passing back and forth, voices hushed but urgent. No one had gone inside. Not again. Not after hours of trying and failing and walking away with nothing to show for it. But then one of the staff members slowed as they passed the door, their expression shifting. The crying was different. Still there, but not the same. They paused, listening more closely, as if unsure whether to trust what they were hearing. Another staff member approached, then another, drawn by the change they could not explain. No one spoke. They simply stood there, eyes fixed on the closed door, waiting. Inside, Amara continued, her focus unwavering. She had moved through 4 of the 6 babies now, each one responding in their own way, each one settling just enough to make space for the next. Her body ached, her arms growing heavier with each moment, but she did not stop. She could not. Not when she could feel the difference it was making. Not when the sound of the room was finally shifting into something that resembled peace. She reached the 5th crib, her hands gentle as she lifted the child, bringing them close, her breathing steady even as her heart pressed against her ribs. For a brief moment, doubt tried to surface. This was not her place. These were not her children. But the thought did not stay. Because in her arms, the baby quieted, just like the others, and the truth was simple in a way nothing else had been. They needed something real. They needed something human. At the far end of the room, the last baby cried alone now, the sound no longer lost in chaos, but clear and distinct. Amara looked toward that final crib, her gaze soft but certain. She took one step, then another, moving through a room that no longer felt out of control. And just as her fingers reached the edge of the crib, just as she leaned in to lift the final child, the door behind her opened. The sound was quiet, controlled, but it cut through the room with absolute authority. Amara froze, not out of fear, but out of awareness. She did not turn right away. She did not speak. The room held its breath again, but this time it was different. Because for the first time since she had entered, the crying had almost completely stopped. And in that near silence, every movement mattered. Vincent Moretti did not announce his presence. He never had to. The room felt it before anyone turned, before a single word was spoken. His footsteps were quiet against the polished floor, measured, controlled, but they carried a weight that shifted everything around them. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits remained at the doorway, still as statues, their attention fixed but silent. Vincent stepped into the nursery and stopped, not because he hesitated, but because what he saw did not match anything he had expected. The crying was gone, not completely, but enough that the absence of it felt louder than the noise ever had. 6 cribs, 6 children, and in the center of it all, a woman who was not supposed to be there. Amara stood frozen for only a second, then slowly turned, the last baby still resting in her arms. She did not step back. She did not rush to explain. Her breathing remained steady, even as every instinct told her exactly who had just walked into the room. Vincent's gaze moved across the space with precision, taking in every detail. The stillness of the babies, the softened air, the way the tension that had lived in this room for days had somehow shifted into something unfamiliar. Then his eyes landed on her, on the woman holding his child as if she belonged there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick and deliberate. It was the kind of silence that usually came before decisions were made, before consequences were carried out. But this time, it held something else, something uncertain. Amara adjusted her hold slightly, the baby in her arms stirring but not crying. She kept her voice low when she finally spoke, not defensive, not afraid, just honest. They were tired, she said quietly. Vincent did not respond right away. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, subtle enough that most people would miss it. He stepped closer, his attention drawn not to her first, but to the cribs. One by one, he looked at them, as if confirming what he was seeing was real. 6 children, resting, not struggling, not crying, just breathing. The room felt smaller now, not because of space, but because of what it held. Amara remained where she was, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady. She did not look away. She had nothing to hide. Behind Vincent, one of the men shifted slightly, as if waiting for a command, for a signal that would return everything to the order it had always followed. But no command came. Vincent reached the nearest crib and rested his hand lightly against the edge, his gaze lingering on the sleeping child inside. The lines of exhaustion on his face had not disappeared, but they had changed. Less sharp, less desperate. He glanced back at Amara, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to calculation. "Who told you to come in here?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, carrying the same authority that had built his world. Amara shook her head once. No one. The answer hung between them. Simple, direct. Vincent studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing something he could not quite define. Then his gaze dropped briefly to the child in her arms. Now completely still, small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the others. Another silence followed, but this one was different. It did not feel like judgment. It felt like recognition. He exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding for longer than he realized. Then, without raising his voice, without looking away from the scene in front of him, he spoke. "Put her down," he said. Amara did not hesitate. She stepped forward carefully, placing the baby back into the crib with the same gentle precision she had used all along. When she stepped back, the room remained unchanged. No crying, no chaos, just quiet. Vincent watched for a few seconds longer, as if expecting the moment to break, as if waiting for everything to return to what it had been. But it did not. And in that stillness, something shifted in him that no one else could see. No one moved. Not Vincent, not the men at the door, not even the staff gathering quietly in the hallway, just beyond the frame of the moment. It was the kind of stillness that did not come from fear, but from something far less familiar in that house. Uncertainty. Vincent remained where he stood, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the crib, his eyes moving once more across the 6 small bodies, now lying in calm, fragile sleep. He had seen control in many forms. He had built his life on it. But this was different. This was not commanded. This was not forced. This was given. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his gaze returned to Amara. She stood a few feet away now, her hands empty her, posture composed, but not rigid. She did not lower her eyes. She did not step back. She simply stood there, as if she understood that whatever came next would not be decided by fear. Vincent studied her, not as a threat, not even as a servant, but as something he had not yet defined. "They have not stopped crying in 6 days," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, less like a command and more like a fact he was still trying to accept. Amara nodded once. "They were not just crying," she replied, her tone even, her words measured. "They were exhausted." The distinction lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable. Vincent's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought. He turned back to the cribs again, watching the rise and fall of each small chest, the steady rhythm that had replaced chaos. Behind him, one of the men shifted again, waiting, always waiting, but Vincent did not acknowledge it. His attention remained fixed on what was in front of him. "The doctors said they were healthy," he continued, almost to himself. "They said there was nothing wrong." Amara took a small breath, her voice soft but certain. "There is nothing wrong with them." Vincent looked at her again, sharper this time, as if testing the weight of her words. "Then why did they not stop?" The question was direct, but it carried something deeper beneath it. Not just confusion, something closer to frustration, to failure. Amara did not answer right away. She glanced at the cribs, at the 6 small eyes that had finally settled, then back at him. "Because they needed something no one was giving them," she said. The room held that sentence for a moment, letting it settle where it needed to. Vincent's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign that the words had reached further than they were meant to. "And you knew what that was?" he asked. Amara did not hesitate. "I remembered." The answer was simple, but it carried a weight that did not need explanation. For the first time since he had entered the room, Vincent's gaze shifted, not to the children, but to her entirely. He saw more now than just a uniform, more than just a presence that had broken a rule. He saw the steadiness in her stance, the quiet certainty in her voice, and something. else beneath it, something that did not come from training or instruction, something that came from loss. The realization did not change his expression, but it changed the way he looked at her. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was deliberate. Vincent straightened slightly, his hand dropping from the crib, his posture returning to something more familiar, more controlled. But the room had already changed, and so had the moment. He turned just enough for the man at the door to see his face, though his eyes remained on Amara. "Everyone out," he said. The words were calm, but absolute. The men did not question it. They stepped back immediately, clearing the doorway, their presence fading as quickly as it had appeared. In the hallway, the staff scattered, the quiet observation broken by the command they had been waiting for. Within seconds, the nursery was empty again, except for Vincent, Amara, and the 6 sleeping children. The silence settled deeper now, no longer fragile, but grounded. Vincent took one more step forward, closing the distance slightly, not as a threat, but as acknowledgement. "You broke every rule in this house," he said. Amara met his gaze without hesitation. Yes. There was no apology in her voice. No regret, just truth. Vincent held her gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the quiet of the room. "And yet," he said, his voice lower now, almost reflective, "you are the only one who fixed it." The words did not feel like praise. They felt like recognition. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted in a way no one could see, but both of them understood. Vincent did not move away, but something in his presence softened, not in weakness, but in restraint. The kind of restraint that came from a man who was used to deciding outcomes in seconds, now choosing not to. His eyes shifted once more toward the cribs, lingering on the smallest of the 6, the one whose cries had been the weakest, the one Amara had reached for first. The child slept now, peacefully, as if the past 6 nights had never happened. Vincent's jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger, but out of something harder to define. Regret, perhaps, or realization. "You said you remembered," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than before, no longer filling the room, but existing within it. Amara nodded once, her hands resting calmly at her sides. "Yes." He studied her again, more closely this time, as if the answer he was looking for was not in her words, but in what she was not saying. "From where?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Not interrogation, not suspicion, something closer to understanding. Amara took a slow breath, her gaze dropping briefly to the cribs before returning to him. "For my daughter," she said. The words were steady, but they did not need to be louder to be heard. Vincent's expression did not change immediately, but the silence that followed deepened, stretching just long enough to hold what had been revealed. "She passed 2 months ago," Amara continued, her voice even, not breaking, not seeking sympathy, just stating truth. "She was 4 months old." The room did not react, but it absorbed the words, the same way it had absorbed the cries before. Vincent looked at her, really looked this time, and what he saw was no longer just a woman who had broken rules. He saw the space loss had carved into her, the quiet strength that remained after it. He did not interrupt. He did not offer anything back. He simply listened. "My body did not forget," she added, her hand briefly brushing against her side, a small, unconscious motion that said more than her words did. "And neither did I." Vincent's gaze shifted again, this time slower, more deliberate, as it moved back to his children. 6 lives that had come into the world already carrying absence. Their mother gone before they could know her. Their father present, but unable to reach them in the way they needed. The realization settled into him, not all at once, but piece by piece. Power had given him everything he thought he needed, but it had not given him this. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, but heavier than before. "No one told me they needed more than care," he said, his voice lower now, almost reflective. "They told me they were fine." Amara shook her head slightly. "They were cared for," she said, "but they were not comforted." The difference hung between them, simple and undeniable. Vincent's eyes closed for a brief second, just long enough to feel it, to acknowledge it. When he opened them again, the edge that usually defined him was still there, but it had shifted, sharpened into something more focused, more aware. He stepped closer to one of the cribs, his hand hovering above it for a moment before resting lightly on the edge again. This time, he did not just observe. He listened to the quiet, to the absence of chaos, to something he had not been able to create on his own. "And you can keep them like this?" he asked, not as a command, but as a question he needed answered. Amara met his gaze without hesitation. "If I'm allowed to stay," she said. The condition was clear, but it was not a demand. It was a truth. Vincent held her gaze for a moment longer, measuring it, understanding it. In his world, everything had a price, a condition, a consequence. But this was different. This was not about control. This was about something he could not replace. The silence returned, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt decided. Vincent straightened slightly, his posture settling back into something firm, something certain. But the decision he made next did not come from habit. It came from recognition. "You are not going back to cleaning floors," he said, his voice calm, final. "You will stay here, with them." He gestured slightly toward the cribs, not as an order, but as an acknowledgement of where she belonged now. Amara did not react immediately, not because she did not understand, but because the weight of what had just been said needed a moment to settle. Vincent turned his head slightly, as if addressing someone who was no longer in the room, but whose presence still lingered in the structure of his world. "And from this moment on," he added, his voice quiet but absolute, "no one tells her what she is allowed to touch." The words did not need to be repeated. They would carry, because in that house, when Vincent Moretti spoke like that, things did not return to what they were before. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room with a permanence that could not be undone. Amara felt it before she responded, the shift in the space around her, the quiet authority in what had just been decided. She did not thank him. She did not nod in relief. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of what staying meant. Not just a position, not just a change in duty, something deeper, something that would not allow her to disappear again. Vincent turned slightly, his attention moving back to the cribs, but his awareness remained on her. He was not used to granting space without conditions, not used to allowing something into his world that he did not fully control. But this was not something he could command. It had already proven that. "They will wake again," he said after a moment, his voice steady, grounded in reality. Amara nodded. "Yes. And when they do," he continued, his eyes still on the children, "you will handle it." It was not a question. Amara's answer came just as steady. "I will." The exchange was simple, but it carried an understanding that did not need to be explained. Vincent remained still for a few seconds longer, as if committing the quiet in the room to memory, as if measuring it against everything he had endured in the nights before. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. His steps were the same as before, controlled, deliberate, but the tension that had followed him into the room no longer clung to him in the same way. At the threshold, he paused briefly, not turning back, but not fully leaving either. "If anyone questions you," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without breaking the calm, "they answer to me." Then he stepped out, and the door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. The nursery remained still. Amara stood where she was for a moment, listening not to the silence itself, but to what it held. 6 steady breaths. 6 small lives no longer fighting for something they could not name. She exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried in her body beginning to ease, though it did not disappear entirely. It would not. Not yet. She moved again, returning to the cribs, checking each child with the same quiet care she had shown before. Adjusting a blanket here, resting a hand gently there. Not waking them, just grounding them. The room responded to her presence now, not with resistance, but with acceptance. Time passed differently in that space. Minutes stretched, not with urgency, but with calm. Outside, the house began to settle as well. The staff who had gathered earlier moved more quietly now, their voices lower, their steps softer, as if the shift inside the nursery had reached beyond its walls. No one knocked. No one interrupted. The rules had changed, and everyone felt it, even if no one spoke it out loud. Amara reached the last crib again, the smallest child stirring slightly, a faint sound escaping before settling back into sleep. She rested her hand lightly against the edge, her eyes soft, her expression steady. For the first time since she had arrived in that house, she was not invisible. Not because she had been seen, but because she had been needed. The distinction mattered. It changed the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she existed in that moment. She was no longer just moving through someone else's world. She was shaping it. And in the quiet that followed, something else settled into place, something that had nothing to do with power or rules or position. It was not spoken. It did not need to be. It lived in the stillness of the room, in the absence of cries, in the fragile peace that had replaced chaos. And as the night deepened and the house finally began to rest, the nursery remained unchanged, held together by something simple, something human, something that could not be bought or commanded. For the first time in days, the Moretti estate slept. And at the center of that silence, Amara remained steady and present, as if she had always been meant to be there. Morning arrived slowly, not with noise, but with light. Soft sunlight filtered through the tall windows, stretching across the nursery floor in long, quiet lines that replaced the cold glow of the night before. The room felt different in daylight, less like a place of urgency and more like something fragile that had been preserved. Amara had not left. She remained near the cribs, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but held it all the same. One of the babies stirred first, a small shift beneath the blanket, followed by a soft sound that hovered between sleep and waking. Amara moved immediately, her steps light, her hands sure as she reached the crib and leaned in. She did not rush. She did not panic. She simply responded. The child settled again. Under her touch, the moment passing without breaking the calm of the room. One by one, the others followed, waking in their own time, not in chaos, not in desperation, but in something closer to rhythm. The cries that came were brief, contained, no longer echoing through the walls, no longer filling the space with urgency. Outside the nursery, the house was already changing. Staff who had once moved with tension now spoke in lower voices, their expressions uncertain but observant. The absence of noise from the night before had not gone unnoticed. It had spread quietly from one hallway to another until it became something everyone was aware of but no one fully understood. Vincent Moretti stood at the far end of the corridor, his posture still, his gaze fixed on the closed nursery door. He had not entered yet, not since he left hours ago, but he had not gone far either. His presence remained, just beyond the threshold, as if he was waiting for something to confirm that what he had seen had not been temporary. A faint sound reached him then, not the overwhelming cries he had come to expect, but something softer, controlled, measured. He stepped forward without hesitation, his hand resting briefly on the door before pushing it open. The scene inside did not break. It continued. Amara stood near the second crib, gently adjusting a blanket while holding another child close, her movements fluid, unforced. The babies were awake now, but calm, their small sounds rising and falling without urgency. The room held together, not by force, but by presence. Vincent stepped inside, slower this time, his eyes moving across the space as if he was seeing it for the first time. There was no tension in the air, no frantic movement, just a quiet system that worked. Amara glanced up briefly, acknowledging him without stopping what she was doing. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for instruction. She simply continued. Vincent watched her for a moment, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, but no longer guarded in the same way. He moved closer to the nearest crib, observing, listening, taking in details he had not been able to see before. One of the babies reached upward slightly, small fingers curling in air. Vincent hesitated, just for a second, then extended his hand. The contact was brief, uncertain, but real. The child did not cry. It simply settled, as if recognizing something it had been missing. Vincent withdrew his hand slowly, his jaw tightening, not from discomfort, but from something deeper, something that did not fit into the structure he was used to controlling. He turned his head slightly toward Amara, his voice low when he spoke. "They are different." It was not a question. Amara nodded, her attention still on the child in her arms. "They feel it," she said. Vincent did not ask what it was. He already understood. Not completely, not in a way he could explain, but enough to know that it was not something he could replace. The room held that understanding without needing to define it. And as the morning light continued to settle across the floor, the distance between power and something far more human grew smaller, not through force, but through something quieter, something that had already begun to change everything. The change did not happen all at once. It never does. It settled in slowly, like the morning light that now filled the nursery each day, replacing the harsh glow that once defined the nights. The crying did not disappear forever, because no child grows without needing something. But it was no longer endless, no longer desperate, no longer the kind of sound that made an entire house hold its breath. It became something else, something manageable, something understood. Amara moved through the space as if she had always been part of it, her presence no longer questioned, no longer hidden behind lowered eyes or quiet footsteps. She was no longer just the woman who cleaned the floors. She was the one the room responded to, the one the children settled for, the one who understood without needing to be told. And the house adjusted around that truth. Staff who once overlooked her now paused when she passed, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Instructions changed without needing to be announced. Schedules shifted. The rhythm of the estate, once built entirely around control, began to bend around something far less rigid. Vincent watched it all, not from a distance, but from within it. He did not interfere. He did not question. He observed. Days passed, then nights, and each one confirmed what he had already begun to understand. This was not temporary. It was not luck. It was not something that could be replaced. One evening, as the light faded and the nursery settled into its quiet rhythm once more, Vincent stood just inside the doorway, his presence no longer disrupting the space the way it once had. Amara was seated near the window, one child resting against her shoulder while the others lay calm in their cribs. The room felt full, not with noise, but with something steadier, something grounded. Vincent remained still for a moment, taking it in, the same way he had on that first night, but without the uncertainty that had followed him then. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze moving across the children, then settling on her. "They know you," he said, his voice low, not as an observation, but as a realization. Amara looked up briefly, her expression calm. "They feel safe," she replied. Vincent nodded once, the motion small but certain. Safe. It was a word that had never held much weight in his world. Not in the way it did here. Not in the way it did now. He moved closer to one of the cribs, resting his hand lightly against the edge, watching as the child inside remained still, undisturbed by his presence. That alone would have been impossible days ago. He glanced back at Amara, his expression unchanged, but his voice quieter than it had ever been. "I built everything to protect them," he said, and it was not enough. Amara did not respond right away. She did not need to. The truth in his words was already clear. When she did speak, her voice was soft but steady. Protection is not the same as presence. The sentence settled between them, simple and undeniable. Vincent held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at the children, at the space that had once been filled with noise and was now defined by something else entirely. He did not argue. He did not correct her, because for the first time, he understood. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of breath, full of life, full of something that could not be commanded or bought or controlled. Vincent straightened slightly, his posture still carrying the weight of who he was, but no longer overshadowing what stood in front of him. He turned toward the door, then paused, his voice quiet but certain as it carried. "Into the room. No one replaces you." Amara did not react immediately. She simply held the child a little closer, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. Vincent stepped out, the door closing softly behind him, but the words remained, not as a promise, not as a command, but as something deeper. Recognition. And inside the nursery, the quiet held, not fragile, not temporary, but real. 6 small breaths rising and falling in unison. A woman who had once been invisible, now standing at the center of something that mattered. And in that stillness, in that space where power had stepped aside for something more human, the world did not need to speak to understand what had changed. And that day, the house did not just rest. It remembered what dignity feels like.